hug, and gather, we can certainly reach out for support. With Talkspace, you can talk it out with a licensed therapist from the comfort of your home whenever something is on your mind.
So, for example, if you need somebody that specializes in anxiety or depression or relationship issues, there are over 40 specialties in which you can choose from. So you can send your therapist a text, you could talk on the phone, you could do a picture or video message, and this is 24/7 as much as you need to.
Once you're matched with a qualified therapist, you can begin therapy the very same day.
The bottom line here is that you deserve support and you don't have to struggle on your own.
We all need to talk sometimes, and Talkspace gives us the support we deserve at a price we can afford. Match with your perfect therapist at Talkspace.com or download the app. Use promo code WomenAndCrime to get $100 off your first month and help support the show.
It's in our show notes. That's Women in Crime and Talkspace.com. So while you're talking about bail, I think it only makes sense to go into plea bargaining.
Oh, my other research topic. I like to study the process. So I look at bail, I look at plea bargaining and sentencing. So plea bargaining is really the hallmark of justice. Most people still think that there's a trial because of what we see on TV, but that's not true. 95% of cases will be settled via a plea bargain, in which the defendant will be offered some type of deal, whether it's less charges or less time, in exchange for pleading guilty. I interviewed a lot of people when I did my own research who told me, I just pled guilty to get out of jail, just to get out of here. When we talk about plea bargaining, the two players here are the defense and the prosecution. And these are the main players in a criminal court case, and the judge. But the judge used to hold a lot more power, and we're going to talk about why. What happens with the defense and the prosecution, you ever see the scales of justice outside? They're supposed to be blind, they're supposed to be kind of equal, right? Well, This is not how it plays out, because most jurisdictions, they don't provide adequate funding for their indigent defense programs. And this is like your public defenders, because what happens is that most people in the system can't actually afford a lawyer. About 85% of the people who are in the system are considered indigent. And so you have public defenders with excessively high caseloads. They will always tell you how inundated they are. And sometimes they have limited experience, and there's a high rate of burnout. And for anyone who's interested in this, there's a great documentary, Gideon's Army, on it. I would totally encourage you to look at it, what the realities are of being a public defender. So for a point of example, in 2016, the states allocated about $1.8 million in funding to the indigent defense, compared to $17 million categorized as prosecution and court initiatives. We're overfunding prosecution. If we wanted to make it a fair system whereby defendants have a fair right and so does the state, we would equal out the monetary distribution. In some states, the most senior defense attorney is paid $10,000 to $15,000 less than the most junior prosecutor. I know the disparities personally in what prosecutors and public defenders are paid, and prosecutors are paid a lot more. Prosecutors are more likely to charge people of color with crimes that carry heavier sentences than their white counterparts. Federal prosecutors, for example, are likely to charge Black Americans with offenses that carry a mandatory minimum sentence than their similarly situated white counterparts. What we see is a pattern, and the pattern also stems from what we're going to talk about, mandatory sentencing and giving prosecutors way, way, way too much power. But here's where I'd like to bring up a case example. Have you ever heard of, and this one is one that I love, have you ever heard, Amy, of Regina Kelly?
I think there was a movie about her. Is that true?
Yes, you're so good. And I think it's because I talk about it, but...
I know, I think so.
The movie was American Violet, and I've shown it in several of my classes. I think it's about 10 or 11 years old now, so I probably have to find another one, more current, but it's really great. It's about this woman, Regina Kelly, who lived in Hearne, Texas, and I think that's just north of Houston. I'm not sure how far, but a little bit north. And Regina was swept up into a raid of her housing project where she lived with her 4 children in the year 2000. She was the subject, and this housing project was the subject of a major DEA bust. But the DEA there, first of all, they were busting, disproportionately these types of housing projects. And they were working on, in this particular bust, information from a very unreliable confidential informant. Regina was arrested. She was held, obviously, because she could not make bail, and she was expected to plead guilty to a drug crime like most of her peers. Her public defender came in and told her, take the deal. You'll get a good deal. You'll get out. It'll be quick. It'll be easy. But Regina really refused. She was really incensed by this. She claimed complete innocence, not only that she hadn't done anything, too serious, but she said she was not involved whatsoever in selling drugs. And then she would not take a plea to anything that she did not do. So Regina was a holdout. While a lot of her peers were taking these pleas, she held out, she fought, she got the ACLU on her side. And she was actually successful in getting her charges dropped, although it took some time. But this also evolved as they learned about how unreliable the confidential informant was. But you also have to realize the confidential informant was also a Black man who had pressure on him to deliver. So it's, the systemic problem. So what happened to Regina? She won, her charges were dropped, and Regina was successful in getting Texas law changed. And in what way? It was really in how they valued information from confidential informants. So that part was great, but the part that wasn't so great was that the DA, the district attorney at the time, was reelected again, and he was part of that, a huge part of the problem. And Regina said that she really felt like she had to leave because of the harassment from law enforcement. She didn't feel comfortable or safe anymore. But she was successful in getting some changes implemented, and she does a lot of talks and speeches, and she's a very powerful advocate here for reform. The policy implication, one of them, is to get rid of mandatory minimum sentencing, and that is basically where there is a mandatory sentence that must be served for specific crimes, and no judge can depart from that. For example, used most frequently, drug laws. There's a 10-year minimum for most of the serious felonious, I shouldn't even say serious felonious. There's a 10-year minimum sentence for a number of drug crimes, which means that if you are convicted of that, you're serving the 10 years and there's no option about it. It also means that the prosecutor has more power again. Prosecutor will say, if you don't plead guilty to something else, I'm going to charge you with a mandatory minimum crime. And when you're found guilty, you're serving these 10 years and no judge is going to be able to help you. Also want to point out that these mandatory minimums came during the war on crack and cocaine, and they are disproportionately leveraged at the Black community and especially at the time with crack users. Did you want to add something, Amy?
Oh, I really want to emphasize that discretion going from the judge to the prosecutor is a very dangerous thing because judges' hands are tied. And we see lots of judges who had a lot of issues with this because they would see a single mother who was living on the street, who was really trying to provide for her children, and they could not even take into consideration her individual circumstance. And I think some judges had a real issue with that.
If you think about it, Amy, the judge is supposed to be the referee, the arbiter, the unbiased one, right? The defense and the prosecution are playing out against each other. So how can we put all the power in the one side who has a vested interest and take it away from the person who's supposed to referee those? It doesn't make any sense.
And they have all the money.
It doesn't make any logical sense. When it comes to sentencing, Black males and females are also, I said it before, sentenced more harshly for crimes than their white counterparts, and especially when they commit a violent crime against a white victim. Which brings me to the case of Lena Baker. Lena was a Black woman who began work as a maid for her white male employer, Ernest Knight, in 1944, and this was in Georgia. She was only employed there for about a year, but Lena was sexually assaulted by Knight on several occasions, and she was also held by him as a prisoner in the home, sometimes for days at a time. She reported also being beat by his son several times. And one night when she was trying to escape her rapist, Ernest pulled out a pistol, Lena grabbed it, and she shot him in self-defense. Lena immediately reported the incident to the police, who subsequently arrested her for the murder. Lena was tried by an all-white male jury, and they convicted her of capital murder, for which she was convicted, sentenced to death, and electrocuted. However, years later, in 2005, Lena was granted a posthumous pardon, which means that she was pardoned for her crime after her death because they acknowledged that it was in self-defense. And there was also a finding at that time that the Board of Pardons at the time had the ability to commute her sentence and lower it instead of going for electrocution. but they went for the death penalty in this controversial case.
Do you know about the Baldus study that was used in the Supreme Court case McCluskey versus Kemp?
I know McCluskey, but what's the Baldus study?
So this one analysis found that defendants accused of killing white victims were over 4 times more likely to receive the death penalty than defendants who were accused of killing black victims. So I think that case you just shared really highlights that disparity.
You know what? I did know that. Thank you for sharing that, though. I forgot. And yeah, I think this case absolutely does. And now we're going right down the line, and I think we're moving from sentencing probably to the correctional aspect, sentencing to corrections and reentry. Amy, you want to take over a little bit here?
Yeah, so we know that black adults are much more likely to be incarcerated than white adults. The number is close to 6 times more likely. And among youth, African Americans are about 4 times as likely to be committed to a secure placement as whites.
Does that mean like a juvenile detention center?
Yeah, exactly. So that's including juvenile detention center or for those who are waived up to adult.
Okay.
So mass incarceration, of course, leads to mass reentry for those that are, I guess, lucky enough, so to speak, to eventually get out.
About how many people return home from prison a year or let out a year? Is it something like I think
close to 700,000?
Okay, yeah, I was going to say 650, but that's probably my number is dated. Thank you.
The number is about 2.3 million people that are under the form of some sort of correctional facility, and I believe the number is about 700,000 that are being released to society. So really, it would be great if we as a society really embrace these individuals and try to help them reenter society. However, unfortunately, we do not always do that. Mass incarceration, of course, then leads to mass reentry. And when an individual returns to society, there is what is known as collateral consequences, which are additional civil penalties that really attach to criminal convictions. So people with criminal records face a host of obstacles to re-enter society even after they have fully completed their term of incarceration or community supervision. Denied access to employment, certain licenses, not being able to access housing loans or student loans, housing discrimination. It's basically any obstacle that hinders an individual from being successful upon release. And we know that African Americans are exposed to these collateral consequences at a higher rate.
I remember, just so you know, in the movie American Violet, Regina realizes, that's not who plays her, but she realizes that a lot of the people who were arrested and pled guilty quickly to get out are now no longer allowed to live in the housing development because that's one of the losses. If you plead guilty to a drug crime, you lose subsidized housing. They also could not access any more welfare benefits such as food stamps or Medicaid because that is also something else you lose as a result. And there are a number of other scholarship opportunities. There's just so many things that people do not realize. Once they plead guilty, they're going to lose later on.
And this also becomes a catch-22, especially if you're on parole, because a lot of the conditions of your parole are simply not possible to meet. For example, you need somewhere to live. But if everyone that you have connection with lives in, say, public housing, in some states you can't live with them. You're basically shut out from a lot of employment opportunities, but a condition of your parole is to remain employed. You have to meet a curfew, but you might only be able to get employment in the night shift. So we can see this time and time again of situations where people simply cannot meet their conditions.
I saw this just personally. I saw this over and over again as a federal probation officer, and I saw what the expectations were not aligned with what they could realistically accomplish. Even those who were trying so very hard to meet them, they still could not, and then we punished them for it. Now, I know that, both men and women are facing these challenges, but I think that are there not some unique reentry challenges for women?
There are, but before we get to that, I just wanted to say that there's a lot of research on this, but some studies say that 1 in 3 Black men have a conviction on their record. So we're dealing with a large segment of the population. And when we're looking at the percentage of African American men who are of voting age, over 7% cannot vote simply because they have a felony conviction on their record. And that's 4 times higher than white people.
Haven't we talked about this issue and how it would have changed elections had this percentage or had this segment of the population been able to vote?
Yep, there's a great study that talks about the likelihood that Gore would have been elected over Bush if in Florida people with a felony conviction would have been able to vote. So there are some unique reentry challenges for women. Women are often mothers, caregivers, and heads of households. So once they're incarcerated, their children often become displaced and unfortunately often end up in foster care. And that's a whole other issue.